Big Shaq was minding his own business until he witnessed something that made his blood boil. A cop stood in the middle of a homeless encampment, grinning as he ripped down an elderly man's only shelter. The flimsy tent collapsed, scattering his few belongings onto the cold pavement. People watched, phones recorded, but no one stopped him. Then Shaq stepped forward. What happened next set the internet on fire, exposed years of corruption, and led to a downfall so brutal that even Shaq couldn't have predicted it. But the real shock? By the end, the cop would be the one begging for help. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the city park, where a small group of homeless people huddled near their tents. The air smelled of damp grass and cheap coffee, a stark contrast to the distant scent of expensive meals wafting from nearby restaurants. Big Shaq moved through the encampment, his hands full of food and supplies. "Here you go, OG," Shaq said warmly, handing a wrapped sandwich to an elderly homeless man named Harold. His frail hands trembled slightly as he took it, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You always look out for us," Harold murmured, his voice hoarse from years of hardship. Shaq nodded. "Stay strong." But before Harold could even take a bite, the sound of heavy boots stomping across the pavement shattered the moment. Officer Daniels, a broad-shouldered cop with a permanent sneer, approached with a disgusting smirk stretched across his face. He scanned the encampment like it was a pile of garbage, his hand resting lazily on his belt. "Look at this mess," Daniels muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Bunch of freeloaders wasting space." Shaq, still crouched beside Harold, slowly straightened up. His towering frame loomed over the officer, his presence alone enough to make most men think twice. "Ain't nobody freeloading," Shaq said, his voice calm but firm. Daniels, however, wasn't most men, or maybe he was just too arrogant to care. He let out a scoff, rolling his eyes as if Shaq's words meant nothing. Without another word, he reached down and grabbed the edge of Harold's tent. Then with one violent yank, he ripped it down. The fabric tore as the metal frame collapsed like a dying animal, sending Harold's few belongings spilling onto the pavement. A half-empty water bottle rolled away, coming to a stop near Shaq's foot. Harold gasped. "No, please!" But Daniels just laughed, a cruel, heartless chuckle that echoed through the park. "If you don't like it," he taunted, meeting Shaq's gaze with a smirk, "do something about it." Shaq took a step forward, his eyes locked onto the officer. "Bet." Daniel's smug laughter hung in the air like poison. The crumpled tent at his feet, Harold's desperate expression, and the silent discomfort of the onlookers. It all painted a picture of cruelty that Shaq couldn't ignore. Slowly, Shaq took another step forward, towering over Daniels like a storm cloud about to burst. His broad shoulders cast a long shadow over the officer, and the playful glint in his eye was gone. "Pick on someone your own size." Daniel's smirk didn't fade. If anything, it grew wider. He squared his stance, puffing out his chest in a poor attempt to seem unfazed. "You think being tall makes you tough?" he scoffed, tilting his head as if Shaq was nothing more than an oversized nuisance. Shaq didn't blink, didn't flinch. His voice was calm but heavy with purpose. "Nah, but standing up for people does." A ripple of whispers passed through the park as a small crowd began to gather. A few people pulled out their phones, holding them up, fingers pressing record. Daniels noticed the cameras, but it only made him double down. His pride wouldn't let him back down now, not in front of all these people. He chuckled, shaking his head. "What, you gonna play hero? You think you're somebody?" His smirk returned as he leaned in slightly, voice dripping with mockery. "Let me guess. You think you can make me look bad?" Shaq's eyes narrowed. "I don't have to," he said smoothly. "You're doing that yourself." The cop's expression flickered, just for a second, but Shaq saw it. A crack in his confidence. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. More people raised their phones. The air shifted, thick with anticipation. Daniel scoffed, but his voice wasn't as steady this time. "I don't answer to you." Shaq's lips curled into a slow, knowing grin. "Oh, you're about to." The tension in the park was electric. The small crowd that had gathered now grew, more people pulling out their phones, their screens glowing as they recorded every second. Officer Daniels had an audience now, and he knew it. Shaq, still towering over the cop, reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a single tap, he started recording. "All right, everybody," Shaq said. his deep voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "This is Officer Daniels, and this right here? This is what abuse of power looks like." He turned the camera toward Harold, who stood beside the wreckage of his tent, his frail hands shaking. His belongings, a worn-out blanket, a few personal items, were scattered across the pavement. "This man," Shaq continued, zooming in on Harold's devastated face, "had a home. A small one, yeah, but it was his. And this cop right here, he tore it down. For fun." Daniel's expression shifted. His eyes darted to the cameras around him, and for the first time, he realized he wasn't in control. His jaw clenched. "Turn that off." Shaq didn't move. "Or what?" Daniel swiped at the phone, trying to knock it out of Shaq's hand. Bad move. Shaq didn't even flinch. His grip was solid, unmoving, unbothered. He let out a low chuckle. "Oh, you want to add assault to the list now? Keep going, bro." A few people in the crowd gasped. Someone in the back laughed nervously. A woman's voice rang out, "Oh, he messed up now." Daniel's face turned red. He stepped back, straightening his uniform, trying to act like he wasn't unraveling. But the damage was done. Shaq smirked as he turned the camera back to himself. "All right, y'all, let's show the world what's happening here." With one tap, he sent the video to his 30 million followers. Daniel's face paled, and just like that, the whole world was watching. The video spread like wildfire. Within minutes, thousands had seen it. Within an hour, it had climbed into the millions. People from all over the country, from every background, were watching, sharing, and commenting in outrage. The hashtags began trending almost instantly. "Justice for Harold," "Dear Year Daniels Exposed," to protect the homeless. It wasn't just social media users who were furious. Activists, public figures, and even local politicians started calling for immediate action. The internet had made up its mind. Officer Daniels had to go. News anchors interrupted their regular programming to air the footage. Clips of the video played across multiple networks. Shaq's deep voice narrating the moment Daniels ripped down Harold's tent and laughed. The contrast was undeniable. A man in power abusing someone who had nothing. The comment sections were relentless. "This man shouldn't have a badge. He shouldn't even have a job. Shaq did more for that homeless man in 5 minutes than this cop did in his whole career. Where is the mayor? Where is the police chief? Do something." And just like that, the pressure on city officials skyrocketed. Back at the park, Daniels could feel the weight of it all crashing down. The crowd around him had shifted. The people who had once watched in silence were now glaring at him openly. A woman standing near the benches had her arms crossed, shaking her head in disgust. A man who had been recording muttered under his breath, "Pathetic." Daniel's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He could feel the heat creeping up his neck. His face burned, not from embarrassment, but from something far worse. Rage, panic, fear. Then, his radio crackled. A burst of static filled the tense air, followed by a sharp, authoritative voice. "Officer Daniels, report to the station, immediately." The park went still. Daniel's fingers twitched as he reached for the device clipped to his vest. The tone of the voice was unmistakable. This wasn't a routine call. This was a summons. His superiors had seen the video. They had seen everything. For the first time since this confrontation started, Daniels looked uncertain. His arrogance was fading, the reality of the situation finally setting in. Shaq, who had been watching him closely, tilted his head slightly. His voice was calm, almost amused. "What's wrong? Boss calling you in?" Daniel's entire body tensed. He whirled around, his eyes burning with fury. "You think you can ruin me?" he spat, his voice low and sharp, laced with venom. Shaq didn't blink. He didn't move. Instead, a slow, knowing smirk spread across his face. "You did that yourself." Daniel's face was flushed with anger, his breath coming in quick, shallow bursts as the weight of the moment bore down on him. The whispers from the crowd had grown louder, the judgment in their eyes impossible to ignore. He had spent his career intimidating people, asserting his power over those he saw as beneath him. But now, he was the one being watched. He shoved past a man holding up his phone, nearly knocking it out of his hands. "Move!" Daniels barked, his voice tight with frustration. Shaq didn't let him slip away so easily. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his deep voice cutting through the noise. "Where are you running, tough guy?" Daniels stiffened but didn't turn around. His fists clenched at his sides, his entire body wound tight like a coiled spring. He needed to get out of here, now. Without another word, he pushed through the gathering crowd, his movements rough and frantic. People moved aside, but not fast enough for his liking. Someone muttered, "Coward." Another snickered under their breath. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears as he spotted his patrol car parked at the curb. His way out. He picked up his pace, practically lunging for the driver's side door. His fingers fumbled as he yanked it open, his heart hammering in his chest. As he slid into the seat, he risked a glance at the rearview mirror. Shaq was still watching him, arms crossed, his face unreadable. Daniel slammed the door shut and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, the familiar hum of power beneath him offering a small sense of control. Not wasting another second, he threw the car into drive and peeled away from the curb, tires screeching against the pavement. Shaq let out a slow breath, shaking his head. Running ain't gonna save you. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone once more. This time, he wasn't recording. This time, he was making a call. A voice picked up on the other end. "Yeah?" Shaq's gaze followed the vanishing patrol car as it weaved through traffic. His expression hardened. "Let's take this all the way." The fallout from the video was too big to contain. Within hours, news stations were broadcasting the footage on repeat. Political analysts debated it on live television. Community leaders called for action. The entire city was watching, waiting to see what would be done. Shaq sat in his car, parked outside the same park where it had all begun. His phone had been ringing nonstop. Messages flooded in from reporters, activists, even people he hadn't spoken to in years. But he ignored them all, until one number made him pause. His phone screen flashed, City Hall. He answered. A crisp, controlled voice spoke on the other end. "Mr. O'Neill, this is Mayor Lasker. I wanted to personally inform you, we're handling it." Shaq's jaw clenched. He leaned back against the seat, gripping the wheel. "Handling it?" he repeated, his voice low. There was a pause before the mayor continued. "We've reviewed the footage, and Officer Daniels has been placed on immediate suspension while we conduct an investigation." Shaq exhaled slowly, staring out the windshield. His mind flashed back to Harold, a broken man, watching his only shelter get torn apart like garbage. "You think a suspension is enough?" Shaq asked, his voice edged with disbelief. The man abused his power for years. He targeted the most vulnerable people in this city, and y'all are putting him on a timeout? Another pause. The mayor sighed. "Look, I understand your frustration, but we have policies in place. We can't just fire him overnight." Shaq's grip on the wheel tightened. He wasn't the kind of man to lose his temper. But this was unacceptable. A few hours later, the mayor stood behind a podium, cameras flashing from every direction. An emergency press conference. The city had no choice. The public demanded action. Mayor Lasker cleared his throat before speaking. "We have officially placed Officer Daniels on indefinite suspension, pending an investigation. We take these allegations seriously and will conduct a full review of his past conduct." Shaq watched the broadcast from his phone, standing just outside his car. The words sounded polished, rehearsed, damage control. He clenched his jaw, shaking his head. This wasn't justice. "That's not enough," he muttered. And just like that, he made a decision. This fight wasn't over. Not even close. Shaq knew a suspension wasn't justice. It was a delay tactic, a way for the city to calm public outrage without actually fixing the real problem. But he wasn't going to let it slide. Sitting in his home office, Shaq pulled up his laptop. If Daniels had done this once, he'd done it before. Shaq didn't believe in coincidences, especially when power was involved. Within minutes, he was scrolling through public records, old news articles, and community forums. He wasn't just looking for dirt, he was looking for patterns. And it didn't take long before something caught his attention. There were complaints, a lot of them. Daniels had been reported multiple times for harassment, and every single complaint had been dismissed. The records stretched back years. A homeless veteran had accused Daniels of smashing his belongings. Case closed. No evidence. A woman living out of her car reported that Daniels slashed her tires to force her to move. Case closed. No action required. A street vendor had filmed Daniels knocking over his food cart. The footage mysteriously disappeared. Shaq's stomach tightened. This wasn't just one bad cop. This was a system that had protected him. He kept digging, checking forums where locals shared their experiences. That's when he found a private post from a former officer. "The department knows. They've always known. Daniels does the dirty work they don't want their hands on. Shaq exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. This went deeper than he thought. Without hesitation, he compiled everything. The reports, the statements, the proof that complaints had been ignored. He put it all in a file and sent it to every major news station. Within the hour, headlines started flooding in. Police department under fire for covering up homeless abuse complaints. Officer Daniels' history of misconduct finally exposed. How many more were ignored? The backlash wasn't just against Daniels anymore. It had reached the top. Shaq's phone buzzed with a notification. A live press conference scheduled for that evening. The speaker, the police chief, the system had protected Daniels for years. But now, it was about to crumble. Daniels had spent his entire career untouchable. No matter how many complaints were filed against him, no matter how many people he mistreated, the system had always protected him. Not this time. The city was in uproar. News stations played Shaq's video on repeat. But now the headlines weren't just about the tent incident. They were about the years of unchecked abuse that followed. The press conference with the police chief had done nothing to calm the storm. Instead, it had added fuel to the fire. Under immense public pressure, the city had no choice. Daniels was fired. The announcement came in the form of a blunt, unemotional statement from the mayor's office. Effective immediately, Officer Daniels has been terminated from the force. We are committed to reviewing past complaints and ensuring accountability within our department. But Daniels didn't need to read the statement to know his life was over. He found out when he stepped outside his house that morning, only to find it vandalized. His stomach dropped as he took in the sight. Red spray paint covered the front of his once pristine home. One word, bold and unmistakable, was scrawled across the walls. Karma. The mailbox was smashed. His tires had been slashed. Someone had left a pile of garbage bags on his porch, their contents spilling onto the steps. His fingers curled into fists. He turned back toward the house, his mind racing. Maybe he could lay low for a while. Maybe the outrage would die down. Maybe... I want a divorce. Daniel stopped cold. His wife stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face unreadable, but her voice final. I won't have our kids growing up under this, she said simply. I'm leaving, and I'm taking them with me. Daniel's world tilted. His throat tightened as he stared at her, searching for any sign of hesitation. There was none. She disappeared into the house, emerging moments later with a suitcase. Their two young children followed, their little hands gripping the straps of their backpacks. They didn't even look at him as they walked past. Daniels felt his chest tighten. Wait, he choked out. We can fix this. His wife didn't stop walking. She opened the car door, helped the kids inside, then slid into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life. Daniel stood frozen on the porch as his family, his last chance at holding on to something real, drove away. Days passed. The media moved on to new scandals, but Daniel's world remained shattered. His house, his reputation, his family, all gone. And then one night someone spotted him at a gas station. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt, his face hollowed by exhaustion. He wasn't in uniform anymore. He wasn't in his house. He was living in his car. The night was quiet, the hum of the city reduced to distant traffic and the occasional flicker of neon signs. Shaq sat behind the wheel of his SUV, cruising down a near-empty street, his mind on everything that had unfolded over the past few weeks. Daniels had fallen hard, fired, humiliated, abandoned by the system that once shielded him. Shaq didn't feel bad for him, not yet. Then as he slowed at a red light near a rundown gas station, something caught his eye. A familiar figure stood near the entrance, hunched over, shoulders stiff. The man's clothes were dirty and wrinkled, his hair unkempt, face hollowed by exhaustion. He was standing near a trash can, his hands clenched into fists. Shaq's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Daniels. Shaq hadn't seen him since his downfall had gone public. But there he was, homeless. Before Shaq could process the weight of what he was seeing, the gas station door swung open with force, and a man stormed out. A customer, mid-40s, beer belly, wearing a stained tank top. His face was twisted with irritation. I told you to back off, man, the customer snapped, shoving past Daniels. Daniels stumbled back, his hands instinctively raising in defense. His mouth opened as if to argue, but he didn't. He simply flinched. And in that instant, Shaq saw Harold. The same way Harold had flinched when Daniels had ripped his tent apart. The same fear, the same helplessness. Shaq's stomach dropped. For the first time, he saw Daniels not as a corrupt cop, but as something else entirely, a man who had lost everything. The customer spat on the ground, muttered something under his breath, and walked off toward his car. Daniels stood there for a moment, then turned toward the gas station window. Shaq followed his gaze. Inside, the cashier was watching him closely, his expression cold. Daniels wasn't welcome inside. Shaq exhaled, the weight of the moment suffocating. Daniels had become the very people he used to torment. Shaq remained seated in his SUV, his hands resting firmly on the steering wheel, as he watched Daniels outside the gas station. The man who had once strutted around with a badge and a gun, tearing down people's dignity like it meant nothing, now stood with slumped shoulders, his back slightly hunched as if the weight of his own downfall had finally settled onto him. His uniform was long gone, replaced by filthy, wrinkled clothes that clung to his frame in all the wrong ways. His hair, once neatly combed, was now disheveled, sticking out at odd angles. Even from a distance, Shaq could see the exhaustion in his face, the hollowed cheeks, the dark circles beneath his eyes, the way his mouth set in a tight, resigned line. Shaq exhaled slowly, his breath fogging up the windshield for a moment before clearing away. Every instinct in him told him to drive off, to leave Daniels to the very life he had forced others into. It would have been poetic justice to let him feel exactly what Harold had felt when his tent was ripped apart, when he was made to feel worthless. But as Shaq watched Daniels flinch under the sharp words of a customer who shoved past him, something in his chest tightened. Daniels barely reacted. He staggered back a step, his hands instinctively raising in defense, but his eyes didn't hold the same fire they once did. There was no arrogance, no authority left in him. He wasn't barking orders, wasn't threatening anyone, wasn't using his badge as a weapon. He was just standing there. And in that moment, Shaq saw it. He had seen that look before, not on Daniels, but on the people Daniels used to torment. He had seen it in Harold's tired eyes when he begged for his tent to be spared. He had seen it in the faces of the homeless men and women who had flinched under the threat of power. And now, for the first time, Daniels was on the other side. Shaq sighed, running a hand over his face before finally making a decision. He pushed open the car door and stepped out, his large frame casting a long shadow under the fluorescent gas station lights. The sound of his footsteps against the pavement made Daniels tense up, his head snapping in Shaq's direction. The ex-cop froze, his entire body rigid, as if expecting a confrontation. His eyes darted toward the parking lot, as though considering whether to run. But Shaq wasn't here to humiliate him. He stopped a few feet away, his voice steady but not unkind. "Rough night?" Daniels swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. For a second, he looked like he might snap back with one of his usual remarks, but his lips only parted, and after a long silence, his voice came out hoarse and barely above a whisper. "I lost everything." The words hung between them, thick with regret and something else Shaq couldn't quite place. Shaq studied him for a moment. Then, without another word, he reached into his back pocket, pulled out his wallet, and held out a few bills. "You hungry?" Daniel's head jerked up so fast it was as if he had been physically struck. His gaze flickered between the money and Shaq's face, his expression a tangled mess of disbelief, confusion, and something dangerously close to shame. For a moment he just stood there, frozen in place. Then his voice cracked. "Why? Why would you help me?" Daniel sat across from Shaq in a small, dimly lit diner, just a block from the gas station. The place smelled of greasy burgers and burnt coffee, the kind of spot where no one asked questions, no one stared too long, and everyone had their own problems to worry about. Shaq had barely spoken since they sat down, only placing an order with the tired-looking waitress before turning his focus back to the man in front of him. Daniels, on the other hand, looked like he was struggling to even exist in this moment. His fingers tapped restlessly against the chipped edge of the table. His eyes darted around the diner, as if expecting someone to walk in and laugh at his downfall. But no one paid him any mind. He wasn't a cop anymore. He wasn't feared. He was just another man down on his luck. When the food arrived, Daniels hesitated. The plate in front of him held a simple cheeseburger and fries. Nothing fancy, but the smell alone made his stomach twist with hunger. He hadn't eaten a real meal in days, yet he sat there staring at the food, his hands resting uselessly in his lap. Shaq took a sip of his water, watching him. "What? You waiting for permission?" Daniel's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Slowly, he reached for the burger and took a bite. The moment the food hit his tongue, something in him seemed to break. His shoulders sagged, his hands shook slightly, and before he could stop himself, tears burned at the corners of his eyes. Shaq said nothing. He let the silence stretch as Daniels chewed, swallowed, and finally, looked up at him with eyes filled with something Shaq hadn't seen before. Guilt, regret, a kind of pain that only came when a man realized he was never as strong as he thought he was. Daniels exhaled shakily, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought I'd be here." Shaq leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. His tone was calm, steady, but firm. "That's the problem," he said. "You never thought about them either." Daniels closed his eyes for a second, his face twisting as if the words physically hurt. When he opened them again, his voice was so quiet Shaq almost didn't hear it. "I was wrong." Months had passed since that fateful night at the gas station. The story of Officer Daniels' downfall had faded from the headlines, replaced by new scandals, new viral moments. But for the people who had been directly affected, for Harold, for the homeless community, for Daniels himself, the impact was far from over. Shaq had never been the type to stop at just exposing a problem. He wanted to fix it. That's why, standing in front of a small but eager crowd at a local community center, he held a microphone in one hand and a vision in the other. "We can't just call out injustice," Shaq said, his deep voice carrying through the room. "We have to do something about it." Behind him, a banner stretched across the stage. Project Second Chance, a path from homelessness to stability. It wasn't just words, it was action. Shaq had poured his own money, resources, and connections into creating a program that helped the homeless get back on their feet. Housing assistance, job training, mental health support, real solutions for real people. In the front row, Harold sat, clean-shaven and wearing new clothes that actually fit him. His eyes, once filled with exhaustion, now carried a quiet sense of peace. He wasn't sleeping on the streets anymore. Shaq had made sure of that. "I don't know how to thank you, man," Harold had told Shaq when he handed him the keys to his new apartment. "Nobody ever cared before." Shaq had just smiled. "They do now." But the biggest surprise of all was Daniels. The former cop stood off to the side, dressed in a simple button-down and jeans. No badge, no authority, just a man trying to start over. He had joined the program not as a leader, not as someone special, but as another person trying to rebuild his life. It hadn't been easy. At first, no one wanted him there. The very people he had once tormented looked at him with suspicion. But over time, he showed up. Every day without fail. He scrubbed floors, stacked chairs, handed out food. He never asked for special treatment, never complained. And now, as Shaq shook Harold's hand in front of the crowd, he glanced toward Daniels, meeting his gaze with a knowing look. "You finally learned," Shaq said, his voice low enough that only Daniels could hear. Then after a beat, he added, "But it cost you everything."